All right. So I'd like to start with a general statement. I mean, the purpose of government is to keep people safe, keep people safe, and depending on your political outlook, maybe do more than that in helping to foster health and well-being, and that you grow up with opportunity. But what has happened in Maine that has led to, I would say, mistrust in that role of government?
A lot, and most especially during the ice surge, but even before that and since that. And I would add that, and it's related to keeping people safe, is that the government should be in the business of protecting people's rights, in particular their rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And in pretty much all of those areas, the government, certainly the federal government, has been failing to do that since this new administration came into power. I can speak most specifically about the 2 or so weeks that the ice surge happened here. But
Do you
even
want to
before,
explain what the ice surge is?
sure. So ICE is Immigration and Customs Enforcement. It's a federal agency, part of the Department of Homeland Security, and they have been the ones tasked with enforcing the Trump regime's mission of deporting immigrants. And definitions and semantics get very complicated very fast, but they want to rid the United States of anyone who they believe is here illegally, and they use that term very, very loosely. What we saw of the 206 people who were arrested, and I'll come back to explaining what a surge is, but during that surge here in Maine, the narrative being put forward by ICE and the Department of Homeland Security was they were only scooping up people who were the worst of the worst and criminals. And in fact, it looks like only 2 to 4 people out of the 206 they abducted had any criminal record at all. They were going after people based on skin color, accent, name, anyone they pulled over on the side of the road that they couldn't determine, and sometimes even when the person could show papers that they were a legal citizen or here legally, didn't matter. They abducted them and took them away. So a surge, which is what's been happening in different parts of the country, Chicago, Portland, Oregon, most notably Minnesota, where it's still going on, even though the numbers of ICE agents have been reduced. And here in Maine in January, is when they flood the zone. They flood the state or parts of the state with huge numbers of ICE agents whose only purpose in being here is to capture people and detain them and put them into a system that is meant to deport them. So we experienced that surge here. I think at some point, they were saying there could have been as many as 2,000 agents here. It's hard to know because they work secretively. They cover their faces. They use vehicles that aren't marked. They won't show their ID when they're asked, which is against the law here. So it's very hard to know. There's also other agencies like Border and Customs Patrol, BCP, who can come in and participate in these enforcement actions, as they're called. But what it looks like on the ground, what a surge looks like in reality, is that anybody who doesn't have white skin and speak with an American or English accent is vulnerable to being pulled over in a traffic stop, to being stopped on the street, to being pulled out of their homes and taken into custody, sent to detention centers, and then in many cases deported, often to countries they didn't come from. And that is what happened here. As I say, there were about 206 folks who were kidnapped during the time that the surge was happening. The surge, by the way, was called, they give nicknames. It's very disturbingly and disgustingly framed like a video game. They give names to their little actions that they do. And the name they gave to the one here was Catch of the Day, which is a play on the fact that our maritime economy is based on the fisheries. Yeah. I'm a person of faith. I'm an ordained Presbyterian minister, and I see no coincidence in the fact that the first Sunday they were here, the assigned readings for many of the Christian churches in many Protestant and Roman Catholic traditions was the story of Jesus telling his followers, "I'll teach you how to fish for people." And I said a lot during that time. Any minister who wasn't in the pulpit talking about the evil that was happening outside on the sidewalks was negligent in their duties. Now, I know very darn well that not every minister in every pulpit did talk about it, but in my humble opinion, they should have been talking about it. And in fact, with that said, the faith community here in Maine was at the vanguard and the forefront of resistance efforts, both to push back against the activities of those ICE agents while they were here, and against the federal government, Department of Homeland Security, but also at the forefront of aiding and assisting our immigrant neighbors who were under threat and being harmed, many of whom were sheltering in place, living in lockdown in their homes or hiding in other people's homes while this was going on, afraid to go to work, afraid to let their kids go to school, because those were places where ICE was hanging out and waiting to grab and snatch people, and dads dropping their kids off to school. Moms at the grocery store, a grocery store that literally is maybe 2 blocks that way from the room I'm sitting in now, was a major spot where they would hang out and catch people who were just getting food for their families. But they also started going to people's homes. They would concoct bogus traffic stops and snatch people out of their cars. So I know of a group of older Quaker women, white women, who would go out in the night and retrieve the cars because the ICE agents would take the person and leave the car, sometimes running on the side of the road with the keys in it. And so I call these friends of mine the Holy Rollers. Most of them were Quakers, and they would go out in the night and rescue these vehicles, sometimes from the ICE detention lot, which is kind of huge for them to do. I asked them, where did they get the courage for doing that? And one of them, who's an older white woman, said, nobody thinks that I'm a threat. Nobody looks twice at me. I'm just an old white lady. I can get away with a lot. And she did. She did. But I'm probably getting ahead of myself in terms of your questions and what you'd like to ask about the role of the faith communities here during the surge.
Well, so this obviously splinters or destroys trust in the institutions that are meant to protect us. So where did people find trust, and how was trust reconfigured in this process?
It's a brilliant question, because that's exactly what happened. Thankfully, there were some faith leaders, and I was on the periphery of this. There were people far more involved and engaged than I was back a year before the surge, getting an ICE watch up and running in our state, a hotline, training 1,000 operators and rapid responders who were ready. So when this happened, they were already functioning. We didn't have to try to create it in the moment. It was already there. Many of those people were faith leaders and people from the faith communities. And it became very clear very fast that that organization, and it was a partnership among several immigrant-led and immigrant-serving organizations, nonprofits, as well as faith communities here in the state, who put this together. And both immigrant and non-immigrant folk in the state learned we can trust them. If we call, they will come, they will document, they will have our backs, they will not let us get lost in the system if we get detained. Or if I'm a family member on the outside and my loved one is detained, they will help me. There were lawyers standing ready, willing, and able to dive in and protect people who were detained. Part of the sick system that they set up is they get people out of the state they're from as quickly as possible. So they were loading people onto buses and airplanes and getting them out of Maine as fast as they kidnapped them. And so it became very challenging to try to track where someone was in the system and for their attorneys to have access to them to advocate for them, let alone for their family members to be in touch with them. We had detainees here in the state, and we, the faith community, were very active in supporting them, even though none of them were from Maine. They were from other places, many of them from Massachusetts, which is a state near here in New England. There were about 60 detainees at any given time in a part of our jail. And we, as faith leaders, began appearing there every Wednesday for a prayerful vigil and a presence. And through that, connected with the chaplain in the jail, we're able to connect in particular with the 26 women who were there being detained. And this is unbelievable, but at one point in the surge, some ICE agents detained a corrections officer who worked in that jail, who happened to be an immigrant, illegally. Like, he was here lawfully, he was here legally. They illegally kidnapped him. And the sheriff was livid and outraged and went on TV and said, "This is Bush League law enforcement. This is horrific. I can't believe they did this." Well, that night at 2 a.m., those ICE agents swept into the jail, took all of these 60 detainees, loaded them on a bus, and drove them out of the state, and we couldn't find them. It took a while to find them again. Eventually, most of them wound up in Louisiana. And if you know U.S. geography, that is a very, very long way from Maine. It's way down in the deep south on the Gulf of Mexico. We had put commissary money into their account so they could make phone calls to family and buy personal hygiene items and food items that they might need. That was all lost. It didn't travel with them to Louisiana. It was horrific. And it was done to punish the sheriff for speaking out against the action against his corrections officer who shouldn't have been detained in the first place.
So what I hear you saying is that systems were put in place where people could trust that they would not get lost, that there was somebody, that there was a network of people, strangers.
Total strangers, almost always total strangers. There was also a network through that hotline of volunteers who were walking kids to school, driving people to work, getting groceries for people who were in hiding and delivering them to them so that they didn't have to go out of their homes. That was all grassroots. That was all mutual aid. It was not done through the government, not even at the state or municipal level. It was all just volunteers. Often covertly, we operate mostly on something called Signal, which is an encrypted way to communicate by phone, so that we couldn't be tracked. And in fact, just this past week, we learned that local law enforcement was monitoring social media messaging and communications among the people who were doing all those mutual aid efforts and tracking them, which is creepy and scary and deeply disturbing, but they couldn't track us on Signal because it's encrypted. So they weren't aware of that piece of it, thankfully. But so people who were in harm's way learned to trust those, as you say, networks of strangers who were showing up, who were standing guard outside their child's school, who were showing up on their doorstep with groceries, who would come and drive them to work. Or in one case that I'm familiar with because I was part of it, a group of clergy showed up every morning at 7:15 and every afternoon at 3:15 and stood as a wall of people outside a factory that employed a large number of immigrants, so that they could drive, the white employees of the factory could drive those people's cars up behind us, and then those people could exit the door and get into their car without being seen by the ICE agents who were in the neighborhood, sometimes driving by, sometimes parked in the parking lot, sometimes down the street, and they could get away safely, get to work and from work safely. So all of that web of connection required an enormous amount of trust. I think you're right to ask the question about trust, because if you put yourself in the position of those folks who see a stranger pull up and say, "I'll drive you to work," or I'll walk your kid to school, it takes a lot to trust they're going to have my best interest at heart. They're going to keep me safe. But over and over and over again, that's what happened.
What motivated people to volunteer?
I'm most familiar with what people of faith told me motivated them, but there were lots of people who aren't particularly faithful, don't attend a worshiping community, wouldn't have named it. But because of the population I work with and for, people would say, this goes to the core of what I believe, that there is a dignity and value to every human being, that I am called to love my neighbor as myself, that what is happening here is wrong and violates that dignity and that belovedness of my neighbor, and I have to do something. This is so wrong. I can't sit by. And more people felt like that old saying, silence is complicity. If I sit by and do nothing, I'm condoning it. I'm supporting it, essentially. And more people said, I can't be part of any position that would in any way make this easier for them to do what they're doing. And so you also had people showing up protesting. You had people outside the hotels where the ICE agents were staying, banging on pots in the middle of the night to keep them awake and frustrate them and annoy them. Some of the stuff that came out that I mentioned a moment ago this week shows that it was effective, that the ICE agents were texting and calling our local law enforcement and complaining about how annoying these protesters were. And that's a good thing.
You can go. You can go home. You can go away.
It worked. Yeah, go away and sleep somewhere else. We don't want you here. It was a part of what's hard about describing it, and I think it's equally true in Minnesota, where it's much more robust a system. Even there, it's very grassroots and decentralized, and that's part of what keeps people safe. That there is no, pyramid where you can point to who's calling the shots, that it's very dispersed and low key and quiet and personal. And that's how it's effective. And it also goes against sort of what you'd think would work best, which is a highly organized, centralized, hierarchical system. But that isn't what this was.
Yeah, it's amazing how it's like bloomed. It's sort of like spring.
Yes.
The flowers come out. It's like something happens that is like a force of nature.
It is. It truly is. And it, in a very dark time, it gave a lot of people a great deal of hope. One thing we found out fairly near the end was that those who were sheltering in place, our immigrant neighbors who were in hiding, had no idea of the vast network that had bloomed, as you say, to keep them safe and to confront and try to resist what was happening. And as they found out, their minds were just blown that all these people, these strangers, as you say, that we've never met, that we may never meet, would do this. And lots and lots of people did. And I'm sure I only know the tip of the iceberg, because the very nature of the work is it needs to be quite quiet and kept underground. And so I'm sure there are stories that will come out 30 years from now that I had no idea was happening, probably right down my street. But beautifully powerful witness to what people would do to stand up for their neighbors.
Love thy neighbor is a core Christian teaching.
It is. And for the organization I serve, which is an ecumenical coalition, a council of churches here in Maine, we name that as what motivates everything we do. If we can't trace the why of what we do back to that core value, then we're off track and we need to recalibrate.
And what is the God Squad?
Oh, that is so the factory that I mentioned that we would go and stand and make the human wall in front of at opening and closing every day for those workers. The way we got to be there was that a Roman Catholic priest who's a good friend of mine and who's been very active in the labor movement here in Maine for most of his career got a phone call from the business owner, who's also very big in the trade union movement, and said, Father Mike, would you come and stand with me because I think if a priest was here, maybe ICE would leave my people alone. And Mike said, you should call Jane because she's part of this coalition where there's like 400 churches, which means 400 clergy. And, it's bigger than just me, Father Mike. So let's call Jane. So they called me, and I said, yes, I would come. And the owner mentioned that his family was a multi-faith family growing up, and his dad was Jewish, and that he from time to time attended the temple here in Portland, Maine, but that he hadn't met their new rabbi. And I said, oh, I'll get you in touch with Rachel. So within about 12 hours of that first phone call, it sounds like the beginning of a joke, but a priest, a rabbi, and a pastor walked into this factory, and we sat down with the owner and his wife and a couple of his other employees, and we began to brainstorm, what can we do? And that was at about 10 in the morning. And I said to him, I can be very flippant and sarcastic. It's just in my DNA. And he just imagined the three of us would show up. And I said, oh, Ben, please, we will be able to get lots more people. Just give me a couple hours. I'll put out the signal, and trust me, we will have plenty of clergy here by this afternoon at 3:15. And then I said something like, you can count on the God Squad to show up, or something like that. He'd never heard that before. Those of us who went to seminary, it's like a thing, right? Like if you're a softball team from a seminary, or you're a trivia pub quiz team, that's like a typical name, the God Squad. So I didn't think anything of it. Well, he thought it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. This factory makes sweatshirts. And so he had sweatshirts made for the clergy who came and stood outside, that say God Squad on the back and have American Roots, which is the name of his company, on the front. And when he would talk to the press, he would refer to us that way. But it isn't what we meant for him to call us. It was just something he thought was funny.
Wow, that's a great story. Do you feel so the surge in Maine has finished?
For the most part.
But I'm sure there's still ICE deportations happening because
there are. In fact, the week after it was over, they boarded a bus in Skowhegan, which is kind of in the central part of the state, and abducted 17 workers off a bus who were on their way to a farm where they worked. Took them all. Only one of those 17 had a outstanding warrant for a minor criminal offense. Everybody else, there was no reason to take them, but they took them all. And a week later, they did a similar thing again. So, but it's important to know that ICE and Border and Customs Patrol have always been active in Maine. We have a border with this nation of Canada.
Yeah.
So I live near the airport, the major airport in Maine, which is in Portland. And I can tell you that for years, I've seen ICE vans driving in and around that airport. It makes my blood run cold whenever I would see them. But it was nothing like the surge time when, you could go by the Market Basket parking lot and there were, swarms of these masked thugs in their, cosplay fatigues and guns drawn around some innocent mom who'd just gone to the store to get baby formula for her kids and diapers. And now she's off to Louisiana or wherever they took her. Texas, a lot of them went to Texas. It was like nothing anybody here had ever seen before. And it's not happening to that extent now. Our senator, Susan Collins, claimed she got it to end. Well, no, she didn't.
Yeah.
She was chair of Appropriations Committee, and she went to Trump, who she's a big supporter of, even though she tries to pretend she's not. And they cut a deal. If she did this for him, he would pull the ICE agents out of Maine.
So that she could get reelected
and partly so she could get reelected. She's running again, and it will be a hotly contested race. But let's not forget that while this is all going on, in the middle of this surge, way more than 9, I would say 20 or 30 clergy people from around the state went to her office in Portland, prayed, and asked if they could speak with her by phone to ask her to end the surge. And her response was to call the police and have them arrested. So they were given a chance to leave. Some left, but 9 of my clergy colleagues were arrested that day on her orders. So we can't lose sight of that when people try to say Susan Collins ended the surge.
Yeah, not.
It's much more complicated than that.
And how do you feel that something, the fabric of your community has changed?
Yes, and in surprisingly positive ways. I was on a national webinar hosted by the National Council of Churches. It was me and my colleague from Minnesota, the executive director of the Minnesota Council of Churches, and some other folks. And we were talking about the world as we wish it could be compared to this dystopian hellscape we're living in right now, or dumpster fire is another word I like to describe it as. And what occurred to me as we spoke was, oh my God, we created the world we want to see because of what was happening. Like we learned how to be there for each other. We learned how to walk each other's kids to school and get groceries for each other and stand up and not let someone be taken from their place of work. We learned how to do that because we had to, but I'm absolutely convinced, maybe I'm a little naive, that we won't go back to the isolated, disconnected way of living from before, because now we know what it feels like to live in the world that we dream could be. And it's all because they tried to do what they did. And we were forced. And to me, as a theologian person, that has the fingerprints of God all over it. God is like, here, I'll show you something you didn't expect to learn through all this. And people expressed their love of one another and their sense of community bond in ways that I was born in 1963, so World War II had been over almost 20 years by then. I certainly never saw anything like it before. I imagine maybe it was something like what it felt like here during World War II in America, when the communities came together to try to help and support one another and, have victory gardens and collect their aluminum cans and wine bandages or whatever they did. I just hope we don't forget. I hope that it permanently changes the DNA of our community here, and I have reason to think it has.
That's great. I think that's a beautiful place to end, actually.
Good.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. You're
Yeah,
very
awesome.
welcome.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure to talk about, and it's really important that it's clear that it was so many, the little slice of the pie I talk about, which is the faith community's role. It was so many faith leaders, right? Like I get the privilege of talking about what they all did, but it wasn't me, it was all of them. And they're a pretty amazing bunch.
I was, this is a little perhaps intense, but I was really struck by I think it's the Catholic bishop in New Hampshire.
Yes.
Who
Episcopal.
Episcopal. Do you know what I'm referring to?
Yeah, he said,
get your will
affairs in order.
Get your affairs in order.
Yeah, that's the Episcopal Bishop of New Hampshire. And that was a Saturday night when he stood in the rain and said that. And it had powerful ripples that went out almost instantly. My phone was blowing up with, now it is too, but with clergy saying to one another, did you hear this? Did you hear this? Like this man, it was so powerful and so real.
Can you say what he said?
He said, golly, it's easy to find because they did a transcript of it on the Episcopal Diocese of New Hampshire's website. But he basically was saying, with everything that's happening right now, I have directly communicated with all of the clergy in this diocese, meaning all the Episcopal clergy in New Hampshire, and I have told them in no uncertain terms to get their affairs in order, make sure they have a will, because the time has come to put your life on the line. And he was not mincing words. He was deadly, literally deadly serious. And others, the Catholic bishop in San Diego has said similar things. There are faith leaders bravely speaking up all around the country.
So what do you think that they're putting their trust in? Because,
They're,
you know, because I mean, it's an interest. They're taking a leap beyond their lives.
they are. I think, and again, I speak from a Christian perspective, and there are lots of other faith traditions who would have a different frame for explaining the same exact behavior. But from a Christian point of view, it would be following the teaching not only of love of neighbor, but no greater love does a human being have than to put their life down for another. That it's what we're called to do, and that if you truly believe every person is equally beloved by God and cherished and deserving of dignity, you can't look away and you can't be silent. You have to resist, and it will look different. Not everyone is called to be a martyr, right? Not everyone will be called to lay down their life. Other people will be called to be those quiet people in the shadows who organize the grocery deliveries or the spreadsheets of who's driving who to work this day. There, it looks different, but to do nothing is not an option if you take
Yeah.
your faith seriously. I think that's where the motivation comes. And then secondarily, I certainly experience, and I think most people do, if you see other people being brave, you find it easier to be brave yourself. It's contagious. That courage is bolstered when you see, well, if they can do that, I can too, or I can do something else, that is needed in my circle. That's why silence is so deadly, because if you don't see anyone else being brave, how likely is it that you're going to be the one to stick your neck out?
Yeah, which is why they do this in darkness. Yeah.
But we can operate in darkness
You
too.
can turn the lights on.
Yeah, we can shine the light on them, and we can experience the kind of darkness where it's the darkness of a womb, where life is coming in together, and that it's safe and warm, and we can do the kind of work we did to keep people safe while the abductions were happening here.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for your interest. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and keep up the fight.
Will do.
Yeah.
We will.